A classical conductor heard them and put them on his stage. Alan Parsons chose them after finishing The Dark Side of the Moon. Quincy Jones called their music perfect. 5 Grammy nominations. Then the industry filed them under soft rock and walked away. They fought back with an album produced by the man who made The Wall, and it cost them everything. This is the rise and fall of Ambrosia. The story of Ambrosia begins not on a stage, but in a living room. Specifically, in the living room of Joe Puerta's parents' house in the South Bay of Los Angeles sometime in the early 1970s, where 4 young men spent hour after hour, sometimes an entire day, perfecting a single composition. Not a song they were playing in a club, not a demo they were pitching to a label, just a piece of music they believed deserved to be done right. That obsession was their foundation. Drummer Burley Drummond had connected with bass player Joe Puerta and guitarist-vocalist David Pack through the local musician network. It was not an accidental collision. These men were searching for each other. Keyboardist Christopher North completed the quartet. North brought a feral intensity to his playing, cigarette in hand, glass of wine nearby, coaxing symphonic textures from a Hammond organ like a man who believed every note carried consequences. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. They were products of a very specific Southern California ecosystem that doesn't get talked about enough. Not the Laurel Canyon folk scene, not the Sunset Strip glam circuit. The South Bay, San Pedro, Hermosa Beach, where young musicians obsessed over the technical possibilities of the recording console and the harmonic depth of the British invasion. Their touchstones were the Beatles, King Crimson, Yes, and the Beach Boys. Their goal was music that was, in their own words, all shades, textures, colors, and styles. They rehearsed extensively before they ever pursued a record contract. And then, in 1971, something happened that announced to the industry, quietly, memorably, that these were not ordinary musicians. Through a connection with the Tycho Brahe Sound Company, they were invited to the Hollywood Bowl to test a massive new sound system. Their performance was so precise, so strikingly professional, that it caught the attention of Gordon Perry, the head engineer at the Bowl. Perry introduced them to the legendary conductor Zubin Mehta, who was so impressed that he featured the band in his All-American Dream concert. These were not bar band kids chasing a dream. They were perfectionists who had earned the attention of a classical conductor before they had ever released a single note on a record label. That distinction mattered, and it shaped everything that followed. By 1974, Ambrosia had signed with a record label, and they entered the studio with one of the most respected engineers in the business. Alan Parsons had just finished his work on Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, arguably the most technically precise album ever made at that point. And now he was bringing that same precision to bear on Ambrosia's debut. The self-titled debut album arrived in 1975, and it announced a new kind of California band. The record reached number 22 on the Billboard 200, but the chart position barely captured what the album actually was. It was a meeting point between progressive rock ambition and soulful melody, a style some writers would later describe as melodic prog. David Pack's vocal instrument was warm and searching, capable of carrying the weight of complex arrangements without ever losing its emotional center. The first single, Holding On to Yesterday, climbed to number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100. It showcased Pack's tenor alongside classical violin work from Daniel Kobialka, threading blues feeling through a sophisticated progressive framework. But the track that truly revealed their intellectual ambitions was Nice, Nice, Very Nice, a song built on a poem from Kurt Vonnegut's novel Cat's Cradle. They set Vonnegut's words to a shifting, layered arrangement that made the material feel strikingly alive. The Grammy nominations followed. The debut was nominated for Best Engineered Recording. The follow-up album, Somewhere I've Never Traveled, released in 1976, earned a similar nomination. By every measure the industry possessed, Ambrosia was a legitimate artistic force. And then the relationship with Alan Parsons deepened into something even more significant. When Parsons launched his own studio project, what the world would come to know as the Alan Parsons Project, The band members of Ambrosia played on the debut album Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Ambrosia was not just making their own music, they were also part of one of the most sophisticated studio projects of the era. The music press recognized what was happening. This was America's answer to the sophisticated British art rock movement. Bands like Yes and Genesis, but with a California soul that made them more accessible, more emotionally immediate. They were opening for Fleetwood Mac and the Doobie Brothers. They were building a reputation as a musician's band, the kind of act that other professionals talked about in reverent, slightly envious tones. Everything pointed toward a long, serious career at the highest levels of the industry. The group moved to a new label in 1978 and changed the trajectory of Ambrosia's career in ways that felt, at the time, entirely positive. Under the guidance of executive Lenny Waronker, the band faced a clear choice. They could remain a respected, niche progressive act, the kind of group musicians worshipped but mainstream audiences only vaguely recognized. Or they could lean into their melodic strengths and reach for something larger. They chose reach. The album Life Beyond LA, released in 1978, was the opening move in that strategy. And then came How Much I Feel. It rose to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and fundamentally transformed Ambrosia's cultural standing. Overnight, they moved from being a progressive curiosity to a household name. The song was everything the West Coast sound promised. Intricate vocal harmonies layered over impeccable production, with a warmth that felt personal and immediate. For anyone who owned a car radio in the fall of 1978, How Much I Feel was simply the air you breathed. The momentum carried straight into their next album. 180, released in 1980, was the commercial pinnacle of their career. It produced 2 more gold-certified hits. Biggest Part of Me reached number 3 and earned praise for the precision of its arrangement. You're the Only Woman followed, reaching number 13 and cementing Ambrosia's dominance on the adult contemporary charts. 3 Grammy nominations accompanied 180, including Best Pop Vocal Performance by a duo or a group. The band was everywhere. AM radio, FM radio, television appearances, arena stages. They had achieved the commercial peak that their early industry champions had always believed was possible. But something was quietly shifting beneath the surface of all that success. As the hits grew larger and the audience grew wider, the elements that had made Ambrosia extraordinary, the odd time signatures, the symphonic arrangements, the Kurt Vonnegut lyrics, were disappearing from their records. The deep architecture that their earliest fans had loved was being smoothed away in the interest of radio readiness. To most people listening at the time, it was invisible. The songs were beautiful. The harmonies were perfect. But the band that had impressed a classical conductor at the Hollywood Bowl was no longer the band that showed up on the Billboard charts. They were becoming something different, and not everyone who loved them noticed. David Pack was a man who knew exactly how good he was, and that knowledge in the late 1970s became its own kind of burden. He has spoken about returning to hotel rooms during their tour with the Doobie Brothers and feeling instead a creeping depression. He found himself comparing his vocal abilities to those of Michael McDonald, measuring the gap between where Ambrosia was artistically and where the industry was pushing them to go. The gap was widening. The music industry that Ambrosia entered in the early 1970s had prized musicianship above almost everything else. By the late 1970s, that equation was reversing. Radio formats were tightening. New wave was arriving with its synthesizers and stripped-down aesthetics. The virtuoso was beginning to feel like a liability rather than an asset, too complicated, too difficult to categorize, too hard to sell in the emerging era of 3-minute pop songs and image-driven marketing. For Ambrosia, the pressure arrived in the form of the very success they had achieved. How Much I Feel and Biggest Part of Me were, by any objective standard, beautifully arranged records. The problem was that radio programmers and record label executives heard them simply as soft rock ballads. The underlying complexity, the harmonic sophistication, the production architecture, was invisible to the people who controlled airplay. All they heard was smooth. All they wanted was more smooth. The biggest part of me. Longtime fans of the first 2 albums began to feel a dissonance. The band that had set Kurt Vonnegut's words to music now specialized in romantic ballads. The musicians who had impressed Zubin Mehta with their technical precision were now categorized alongside pop fluff acts by critics who never bothered to understand the difference. And the band themselves felt it. They were caught between two worlds, the serious artists they believed themselves to be, and the adult contemporary hitmakers the industry had decided they were. The progressive rock identity that had defined them for years was being quietly swallowed by commercial demand. This was not a crash, it was an erosion. And erosion, as any geologist will tell you, can be more destructive than any sudden collapse. By 1982, Ambrosia made a decision that was simultaneously their most artistically courageous act, and the one that ended their major label career. They went back to where they came from. The fifth studio album, Rhode Island, was produced by James Guthrie, the man who had worked on Pink Floyd's The Wall. The album was a sonic hand grenade thrown directly at the soft rock image the band had spent 4 years cultivating. Where 180 had featured polished photography and romantic ballads, Rhode Island arrived with album art that signaled a harder edge and a more aggressive tone. A visceral visual language that screamed, "We are not the band you think we are." The music matched the cover, track after track of muscular, heavy progressive rock. The opening cuts drove into territory that genuinely alarmed the executives, material that veered toward heavy rock. The centerpiece of the album was Ice Age, a 7-minute quasi-prog epic that bore no relationship whatsoever to the smooth radio product that had made the label comfortable. The radio programmers who had happily rotated Biggest Part of Me were baffled. The lead single, How Can You Love Me, stalled at number 86. The album peaked at a disappointing number 115 on the Billboard 200, a catastrophic drop from the number 25 peak of 180. The record company was not amused. The label had expected another set of top 10 ballads and had received instead a hard-rocking progressive album that sounded like it came from a completely different band. The commercial logic of their entire career had been upended. Ambrosia chose to break up in 1982 after the album's failure. They had already made one compromise, the long, gradual drift toward adult contemporary that had made them stars. They refused to make another. Exhausted by industry pressure and frustrated by being dismissed as soft rock when they knew what they were actually capable of, they simply stopped. It was not a crash. It was not a scandal. It was not a bitter lawsuit or a public feud. It was something quieter and in some ways sadder. 4 musicians who did everything right and found themselves not taken seriously anyway. The years that followed the 1982 breakup told 2 very different stories simultaneously. As individuals, the members of Ambrosia thrived. As a collective, the Ambrosia name drifted quietly toward irrelevance. David Pack moved into production and found enormous success. He contributed to film soundtracks including White Nights and Beaches, and produced Grammy-winning work for artists like Patti Austin. His talent was never in question. The industry knew exactly what Pack could do. It simply no longer connected that talent to the Ambrosia name. Joe Puerta's path was perhaps the most unexpected vindication of all. He later worked with Bruce Hornsby and The Range, including on their breakthrough album, The Way It Is, which brought him back to the top of the charts and earned him another Grammy. The melodic, harmonically rich bass style he had developed during the Ambrosia years found the perfect home in Hornsby's sophisticated piano and band format. The same qualities that the record industry had grown tired of celebrating in Ambrosia were now winning awards all over again. Interestingly, Bruce Hornsby himself had briefly toured with Ambrosia in 1982, a detail that illustrated just how deeply interconnected this world of high-level musicianship truly was. Decades later, the internet gave Ambrosia something the record industry never quite managed to deliver: context. The yacht rock cultural movement, that online rediscovery of the polished West Coast sound of the late 1970s and early 1980s, swept How Much I Feel and Biggest Part of Me into a new, younger audience. Streaming platforms built playlists around the smooth California aesthetic, and Ambrosia was suddenly everywhere again. The surviving members, Joe Puerta and Burley Drummond, found a steady touring circuit and a genuinely enthusiastic new fan base, but the recontextualization came with a cost. Yacht rock was, at its core, a loving but ironic label. It celebrated the smoothness and escapism of the music, while often treating the artists themselves as benign relics of a self-satisfied era. Songs like Biggest Part of Me, a track that was widely praised for its arrangement, were now being heard on playlists between ironic jokes about white linen pants and sailboats. The original audience knew what was being lost in that translation. They remembered when Ambrosia was a serious band, when the music press took their Grammy nominations as evidence of genuine artistic achievement, not as fodder for nostalgia. The listeners who bought Life Beyond LA on the day it came out remembered a band that had impressed Zubin Mehta, that had played on Alan Parsons' debut record, that had set Kurt Vonnegut to music. Ambrosia was never just smooth. They were never just soft. They were complex musicians who learned to speak the language of the accessible, and in doing so gave a generation some of the most beautifully constructed pop records ever made, while quietly sacrificing their standing as innovators. The death of keyboardist Christopher North in 2026 served as a final, somber bookend to the band's original lineup, closing a chapter on a group that had been, in the truest sense, one of a kind. The nectar of the gods turned out to be something more mortal, but the taste of it has never entirely disappeared. Ambrosia's story is ultimately not a story about failure. It is a story about the cost of being exceptional in an industry that rewards the reducible. They earned the respect of conductors, Grammy committees, and Quincy Jones himself. They wrote songs that still move people across generations and gave a generation its most intimate soundtrack. But history filed them under soft rock and moved on. What's your memory of hearing Ambrosia for the first time? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys through the music that defined a generation.